Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about my little fight analyzation and my fight review of the Terence Bud Crawford versus Israil Madrimov WBA title fight. At least I believe it was the WBA title fight within this fight. Either way, it was for a championship belt at that of the 154-pound weight class, of course, sometimes known as the super welterweight class, other times known as the junior middleweight class, whichever one you prefer. But of course, Terence Bud Crawford, he was favored in this fight, even heavily favored by a lot of odds makers. And I did have Terence Bud Crawford favored in this fight quite heavily. I believe that I even stated that, in my personal view, that this fight was about a 70-30 fight or an 80-20 fight. And this fight definitely was a lot more competitive than what I once originally thought that it was going to be. And if you're personally going to ask me overall, I definitely did expect a little bit more out of that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But of course, for those of you that did not end up hearing about the results, Terence Bud Crawford ended up winning by that of a unanimous decision. I believe that one of the scorecards read 8 rounds to 4 or 116 to 112, and the other two scorecards read 115 to 113, which of course would have been 7 rounds to 5, which I think is pretty decent scoring. I'm not quite sure if it was as close as 7 rounds to 5 in my personal view. I probably would have had it, in the sweet spot of a 8 rounds to 4. But to be fair, I'll have to watch the fight a little bit more tomorrow. I'll have to see. I just don't think that Israil Madrimov threw enough in some of those rounds. And in my personal view, like I stated within my fight prediction, if Israil Madrimov is going to win this fight, he was really going to have to push the pedal to the metal within this fight. Meaning that he was really going to have to take risks within this fight and really try to put the pressure on that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But of course, that's always hard to do within certain fighters, especially when they're all-time great like that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But Israil Madrimov, in my view, he just did not have the courage. He did not have the confidence enough to beat that of a Terence Bud Crawford. And Israil Madrimov tried to play Terence Bud Crawford at his game, which is in the mid-range counter-punching section. And Crawford can pretty much fight you in any way. And Madrimov, overall, he's a little bit multi-dimensional himself. I don't think that he's a one-dimensional fighter, but I just don't think overall that that was the right way to try and beat that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Like I stated within my fight prediction, if Madrimov was going to win this fight, he was going to have to really put the pedal to the metal in this fight and really try to risk it to get the biscuit, meaning that he was going to have to really try and hurt Terence Bud Crawford and make him feel that level of power and make him feel that level of size. And Madrimov, I think, was a little bit girthier, of course, than Terence Bud Crawford. But like I stated within my fight prediction and my analyzations leading up to this fight, to me, it really didn't matter all that much because Terence Bud Crawford was going to be the same height as Madrimov and also with a 6-inch reach advantage. So it really wasn't going to matter that much because in my personal view, the 6-inch reach advantage was going to be more of a factor than what the weight ever really was going to be. Because it's not like Madrimov is a Canelo Alvarez, who is an exceptionally skilled fighter, and on top of that is going to be 20 plus pounds bigger than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Now, to be fair, I don't know exactly what Israil Madrimov rehydrated to or what he weighed in this fight. He looked around maybe around, 170 perhaps. I'm not sure. Maybe, I don't know, maybe even lighter than that because to be quite honest with you, Madrimov, he only looked slightly bigger than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But Crawford definitely looked like he bulked up a little bit within this fight. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think that Terence Bud Crawford really looked that elite within this fight. I think that he looked still good. And of course, Israil Madrimov, in my view, is not a slouch of a fighter. He's probably about an A- level fighter, which was proved after this fight. You do have to be a very good fighter to give even Terence Bud Crawford moving up in weight still a great challenge because, of course, he is debatably the #1 pound-for-pound fighter right now in all of boxing, at least very heavily debatably, right there with Alexander Usyk and maybe a couple of other names like an Inoue or a Canelo, in my view. So of course you have to be a very decent fighter. But I was expecting a little bit more out of Terence Bud Crawford. I thought that his jab was going to be a little bit more crisp. I thought that he was going to be a little bit quicker in this fight than what he was. But a year layoff, of course, that could have been a potential factor within this fight. And on top of that, Terence Bud Crawford, when it came down to it, the fact that he's also turning 37 next month, I believe, in the month of September, that also very well could have been a factor or could be a factor. And I'm not really quite sure, once again, what was the main factor. Maybe a little bit of both. But Terence Bud Crawford, when it came down to it, I thought that personally that he could have done a little bit better within this fight. But maybe overall, once again, for his stature for this weight class and also for his age and the year layoff, maybe he couldn't. But I would not really give this fight an A-grade level performance. There was a couple of people, I believe, within my comment section talking about my fight prediction, stating that, oh, did you see Terence Bud Crawford's dominant performance over Israil Madrimov? Well, in my personal view, this really was not that dominant of a performance. To be quite honest with you, I was a little bit disappointed in that of a Terence Bud Crawford within this fight. But of course, once again, that could be the age, that could be the year layoff. Maybe Israil Madrimov was a little bit more athletic and smart than what Terence Bud Crawford once originally thought he was going to be. And I'll give Israil Madrimov this. He definitely was more competitive and better than a lot of the welterweight fighters that Terence Bud Crawford ever fought at the 147-pound weight class. But in my view, that really doesn't say that much because it's no offense against Crawford, but the majority of the guys that he fought at 147, whether they be Kell Brook or Amir Khan, guys that were pretty much chopped liver at that point in time in their career, or a Jose Benavidez or an Aegis Velasquez, he really, besides Sean Porter or Errol Spence, really didn't fight a whole lot of A-grade level fighters there. It just is what it is. But anyways, I do think that this counts as another A- level win on that of Terence Bud Crawford's career, or as another A-grade level win on his resume or on his record. It's a very great thing what he was able to accomplish, and this puts him up even higher in my view in terms of the grades, of course, because now he's a 4-weight division champion, and of course he's completely undefeated. But like I said, I thought that Crawford once again could have did a little bit better within this fight. But to be honest with you, he just looked slow to me compared to what he used to, because there were certain times where Israil Madrimov would overextend certain punches. But he still overall would have a little bit of a problem. Like, it looked like Terence Bud Crawford to me that he was prepared for some of those counters. It just looked like he couldn't really land them. And to be fair, Madrimov was a little bit better defensively overall than what I thought he was going to be. Yes, his hands were down, a lot throughout this fight, like what they regularly are. But Israil Madrimov was guarding a lot of the headshots very decently well. Now, the body shots, it did not really appear that he had a great answer for, which is a big part of the reason as to why I believe Terence Bud Crawford ended up winning this fight the way that he did. But it was a very decent fight. It was very competitive. That being stated, when we talk about Terence Bud Crawford potentially going up to fight that of a Canelo Alvarez, I just don't think that it's a very good idea. And Canelo Alvarez, he's aging a little bit as a fighter as well. And to be fair, Canelo, he's really not, a natural 168-pounder. He's really more of a natural 160-pounder. But to be quite honest with you, in my view, if Terence Bud Crawford were to go up to 160, I think that that would be way too big of a jump. And I think that if this would have been Janibek within this fight, I think that Terence Bud Crawford potentially would have got stopped. Just in my personal view, or potentially definitely would have lost this fight. So a certain amount of people are really going to compare this to the Canelo versus Dmitry Bivol fight, or going to compare this to the Rigondeaux versus Lomachenko fight, or going to try and compare this to when Mikey Garcia fought Errol Spence Jr. But in my view, it's really not that comparable because these two were more similar in size than what those guys ever were. When you talk about Canelo Alvarez versus Bivol, Bivol is about 6 foot tall with a 70-something inch reach. Canelo Alvarez is 5'7", and he's a guy that really should be fighting probably at the 160-pound weight class. When you talk about Rigondeaux, I don't even remember what weight class he was at, but he definitely was probably about 1.5 to 2 weight classes smaller, at least in terms of the weight than what a Lomachenko was. And same with Mikey Garcia against an Errol Spence Jr. I think that Crawford was only 1 weight class separated from that of a Madrimov, but in my personal view, if he is ever even going to dream of fighting Canelo Alvarez, he's going to have to lose a little bit of that muscle mass in my personal view potentially. It just made him way too slow within this fight. He did not look like the same speedy fighter whatsoever to me. And once again, it also could just be the age, but that's a big part of the reason why, in my personal view, why that fight really shouldn't happen. Because I'm not really a big fan of fights that end up happening and, it's pretty much one-sided in terms of the amount of credit that it's going to go to. I'm not really a fan of fights that are like that, to where basically if the Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez fight happens, if Canelo ends up beating him, especially after this performance, there's really not going to be a whole lot of credit given to Canelo Alvarez's way. Because all they're pretty much going to say is that Terence Bud Crawford is too small for you. And on top of that, he really didn't look that impressive in his last fight anyway. He's getting older. And some of those excuses definitely would be absolutely valid. But at the end of the day, that's a big part of the reason as to why I'm not really super particularly interested within that fight. Because to be quite honest with you, if Canelo Alvarez shows up in the same shape as what I seen him in the Jaime Munguia fight, against that A- level fighter in Jaime Munguia, and Canelo was able to win that fight 9 rounds to 3 over a guy that really is a super middleweight guy and a relatively talented fighter. If Canelo can beat that guy, and Crawford looked this slow and this lethargic in my view compared to his old self at 154, he's going to be very lucky if he can even survive more than 8 rounds against Canelo Alvarez. He's going to be very lucky if he can even survive that far. And that's why, in my view, at least at this moment in time, that fight really just doesn't particularly interest me because I don't think that there's really anything in it for particular for Canelo Alvarez in particular. I think that Terence Bud Crawford, that of course he could potentially reap all the rewards, but personally, in my view, I would rather actually see Terence Bud Crawford try to unify the 154-pound weight class, and then if he ever wants to fight Canelo Alvarez after that, then maybe they can make it happen. But I just really don't have a great interest in Terence Bud Crawford fighting Canelo, at least at this current moment in time. Personally, I would like to see Terence Bud Crawford try to unify that of the 154-pound weight class. But I think that Terence Bud Crawford realizes that if he beats Canelo, that that's going to be a completely different thing. And a lot of these guys, of course, they try to claim that Canelo, that, oh, he's a guy that, overall, he's really doesn't have as great of a legacy and all this other stuff. People know how great Canelo Alvarez is. And there's a reason why when Dante stated that if Crawford were to beat Canelo Alvarez, he would have to be in the conversation as the greatest fighter ever. Right, so Canelo Alvarez is allegedly a guy that doesn't have a big legacy, but if you beat Canelo Alvarez, overall, even moving up in weight, you can be debatably the greatest of all time. So that doesn't make any sense. But anyways, when it comes down to it, I don't think that fight is really particularly interesting. But just to talk about, the reason why I thought that Crawford won the fight, not only do I believe that the reach overall was a factor, I thought that he was defensively in decent shape. Of course, he ended up getting hit with certain shots, but not as much as what I had seen in the past. He definitely looks to be a little bit better defensively within these past couple of fights than what he used to be. Because Crawford was a guy that, even though he's relatively good defensively, he did have some holes in there. And he did get hit with a decent amount of right hands and some left hooks within this fight. Terence Bud Crawford does not avoid a right cross very well, at least within certain fights. Now, he avoided it well enough, of course, not to get hurt too bad, but there was a couple of right hands within this fight that caught Terence Bud Crawford pretty good. But Israil Madrimov, in my view, like I stated, in order for him to win this fight, he was going to have to pressure Terence Bud Crawford. He just was going to have to do it. Terence Bud Crawford had the 6-inch reach advantage over that of Israil Madrimov. Israil Madrimov thought that he was going to be able to spar with Terence Bud Crawford in the middle of the ring and get overall some of his slips and some of his counters. It's not going to work like that all the time with that of a Terence Bud Crawford. You're going to have to get in there. You're going to have to make this a very ugly fight. And I just think that he tried to fight the wrong type of fight. Had he had some of those tactics in only some of the rounds or mixed it up a little bit and then tried to pressure Terence Bud Crawford, I think that potentially he could have won the fight. But once again, I think that he just had the wrong type of strategy, which is pretty much what I was going to predict. He was going to have to try to pressure Crawford, and I just think that he tried to pressure him in the wrong type of way. And there was times where Crawford, of course, because of the power that he had, and of course also because of the boxing skill that he has, he was able to push him back. But we'll see what ends up happening next. That also being stated, let me state this, and I'm not trying to allege anything here for sure, but for those of you, of course, that remember the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury situation a few years ago, remembering that with the glove gate because of all this stuff that the LDBC and new media with what they had alleged, honestly, to be quite honest with you, there was a situation that happened with Terence Bud Crawford once again here, and this to me is a little bit suspicious because this is now the second time that Terence Bud Crawford that something has been up with his professional boxing gloves. Something has now been up with them now for the second time. About a year ago against David Avanesian, his gloves ended up splitting up, both of them. They ended up splitting up overall to the point to where they were damaged and they had to be replaced when it came down to it, which is a little bit fishy for professional boxing gloves unless maybe they were doctored or something was cut into it or possibly removed in some sort of way, or they were meant to be a little bit more a puncher's gloves. And then, interestingly enough, the same gloves overall that Terence Bud Crawford was going to use within this fight, they ended up busting open again right before the professional bout, and he had to be replacing the Everlast gloves with that of the Grand gloves. And interestingly enough, Terence Bud Crawford did not look to have the same amount of power within this fight. Could it necessarily be substantive there? Could there maybe be a little bit of doctoring with the gloves? Maybe, I'm not quite sure. I find it certainly more suspicious than ever what the Tyson Fury allegations were, but I'm not going to allege anything with 100% certainty. Maybe he just had those type of gloves, or maybe it's just the way that he hits. I don't know. But to me, it does seem a little bit odd. Usually boxing gloves don't just split open like that, even with some of the hardest hitters that I've seen. So to me, it is a little bit weird. It is a little bit suspicious, but I'll leave it alone for now because I don't know anything with any certainty. And I don't want to allege anything to try and take away from Terence Bud Crawford's win. But it is a little bit odd in my view that this is now the second time that he's been caught a little bit overall with gloves that end up busting open, either right before a fight or in the middle of the fight. That's a little bit odd to me. But it is what it is. But congratulations to Mr. Terence Bud Crawford for once again proving his greatness. It does appear that he is aging as a fighter. It does appear that the weight was a little bit more impactful than what I once thought that it was going to be. But the question is, of course, where does he go from here? I don't personally believe that the Canelo Alvarez fight is a fight that interests me enough, at least me personally. Now, of course, I'm not the only person that matters out there, but I don't think that a lot of people overall are really going to be super interested in that fight after this. But we'll see overall what ends up happening. Of course, it would still be a big fight, but I just don't think I don't think overall that it would really be looked at as a 50-50 level fight. Of course, it was never going to be looked at as a 50-50 level fight in the first place. But after this fight, to be honest with you, like I stated, Terence Bud Crawford with the speed and you know, him not having quite as good a stamina as what he once did, and of course the power also seeming to be affected when it came down to it. In my view, he's going to be very lucky if he doesn't get stopped within the first 6 rounds against Canelo Alvarez if Canelo really wants to get in on him. So we'll see overall what happens, because I promise you, in that fight, Crawford not only is going to be surprised at Canelo Alvarez's power, he's also going to be surprised at his skill set. And that level of power that Canelo's going to have is going to be completely different overall to what he's ever felt before. I can promise you that. And like I said, if this would have been Janabek or someone at the 160-pound weight class, this would have been hell for that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But, you know, once again, we'll see what he does at 154 pounds, because, you know, there's still certain fights out there like Sebastian Fundora, Tim Tszyu, maybe even the rematch with Errol Spence Jr. I would love to see Crawford try to go for undisputed at 154. Then, to be honest, if he's able to accomplish that, I would like to see him retire. Or maybe if he wants to try to fight Canelo Alvarez after that, you know, maybe he could. But I don't think overall that is going to end up very well. But we'll see what happens. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for my fight review, my little fight analyzation. We'll see what happens. I thought that Crawford won the fight about 8 rounds to 4, but to be honest, I did not think that it was the most impressive performance. I did not think that it was a very dominant performance. I thought that it was a decent performance. I probably would give his fight, you know, probably about a B+. I'll give him a little bit of a break because Terence Bud Crawford, of course, he was moving up in weight, and Madrimov is a relatively talented fighter. But I also expected Terence Bud Crawford to do more within this fight. I expected him to be better with his attacks. I expected him to be a little bit sharper. I expected him, you know, really to be better within this fight. If not knock him out, I expected him at least to win this fight 9 rounds to 3 or 10 rounds to 2. I expected him to be a little bit better in this fight, and, you know, he did not. And that also does have to be talked about a little bit, because when we do talk about the pound-for-pound fighter, people, of course, talk about Terence Bud Crawford being the #1 pound-for-pound fighter because of how dominant he is in the level of competition, quote-unquote, even though Crawford, in my personal view, he just does not have that type of resume. You know, that's why it's a little bit difficult for me to rank Crawford, because even though he clearly is an all-time great fighter in terms of skills, you know, in my view, he's not really quite on the same level of a Mayweather or a Pacquiao or a Sugar Ray Leonard or something like that in terms of the resume, even a Canelo Alvarez. You know, Terence Crawford, I think, is an all-time great fighter, and he's debatably within that conversation of the top 30 to top 20 best fighters of all time or greatest fighters of all time. But I just don't think that I can rank him within my top 10, at least definitively. I just don't think that he has quite the resume. But he is an all-time great fighter for sure. If you were to put him that high, I definitely would understand. But this also is going to have to be talked about, because, once again, if we talk about the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, Alexander Usyk was just recently able to defeat Tyson Fury, someone that was 30-plus pounds bigger than him, and someone that had overall, I believe several inches of reach over him in terms of height and length, in terms of the reach and that of the height. That has to be talked about. Usyk was able to get a top 10 pound-for-pound win over a dude that he probably was never supposed to beat in the first place. Crawford really was supposed to be a little bit more dominant within this fight. He really was supposed to win this, by a little bit more, in my personal view. So that is going to have to be talked about. In a way, also, recently he was more dominant within his weight classes when he moved up than what Crawford was here. That is going to have to be a little bit talked about there, because he is already a 4-weight division champion. And, of course, Canelo Alvarez against Jaime Munguia. And I would say that Madrimov and Munguia, that they're probably around that of the same level of fighter, in my view, around the A- level. Canelo was able to win that fight, in my view, a clear 9 rounds to 3. Crawford, he had real problems with this guy, when he really probably should have not had this many problems, in my personal view. But, it is what it is. So we'll see. We'll see how this is going to be judged. You never personally know, but we'll have to see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Congratulations to Mr. Terence Bud Crawford, and we'll see where it goes from here. But that pretty much is about it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.